Good afternoon and welcome to the first episode of what we call Edelweiss Leadership Unplugged series. I just wanted to give, before I begin and introduce our guest, I wanted to give a quick 1 minute thought behind the idea of this series. And, I've been speaking to many of you, our clients who are logged in here today. And through this time of crisis and adversity and challenge, there have been a lot of questions from many of you as to how other leaders are coping, how other businesses are coping. Is there a playbook that we can adopt to kind of navigate through this time? What are the trends that are emerging? What are the business models that could work? So a lot of these questions came. And our idea today is to start conversing about some of these thoughts, challenges that many of you, our clients, are facing. And, uh, and that is the idea and thought behind curating this series. Today's topic is to reinvent to stay relevant. What does that mean? As you all know, we are going through something unprecedented, something that we have never witnessed before. This is a test of our mettle, not only physical, emotional, financial. So on all counts, all of us are being tested. And how do we reimagine, reinvent ourselves, our leadership styles, our organization structures, our business models, revenue models, market strategy, and so on? So, how do we go to the future, as to say? And I'm very, very pleased and honored and delighted to welcome a great leader, Ms. Arundhati Bhattacharya. She needs no introduction. She has been at the helm of SBI as the first woman chair of SBI, woman chair and CEO of SBI. She was with the group for about 4 decades in what I hear 11 different roles. She has been the head of HR. She has been the head of SBI Capital Markets. She served the New York office and many other roles. Each role more challenging than the previous one and very, very different from the previous one. And now she has taken on a very different opportunity as the chairperson and CEO of Salesforce India. So, from banking to technology, from a government owned institution to an American IT organization. So, this is an incredible journey that Arundhati has come across, navigated through, seen up close and personal many economic cycles, and also dealt with corporate India across, from the small scale to the largest companies in this country. Arundhati, thank you so much. Delighted to have you with us. And if I may just start off with my first question.
Sure. And thank you, Anshu. You really said of lots of good things about me. Thank you very much. And please go ahead.
Thanks, Arundhati. And as we were chatting, most of our clients are business owners, entrepreneurs. They are building companies, they are building businesses, and across different sectors of the economy. It could be also technology, but many are in pharma, FMCG, and so on. And the first segment I wanted to chat with you is on leadership.
Hmm.
And when I was going through your career profile, your career journey, and we were chatting before this call, what struck me was this outside comfort zone feeling. You've stepped outside your comfort zone again and again and again. What made you do that?
Well, like I said somewhere, sometimes I think I'm a bit for a challenge. But I think, to be a little more serious about it, it's just that I feel, taking up these challenges, you get to learn a lot. So, unless and until you step out of your comfort zone, you will not really be able to sort of improve what you already know. The comfort zone happens only when you get quite a bit of knowledge about your situation, what needs to be done, what has been done. And when you go out of your comfort zone, actually, you're getting into a new area, a new field. So it's like an adventure, literally like an adventure, because every day you are discovering bits and pieces about how the whole thing works. how it's all going to sort of come together. It's like literally like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. I remember in SBI, when I was given the job of CGM of new business, a lot of my peer level people, they sort of chat and said, well, your career really seems to be taking a dip, because the people who go in there basically are people who are otherwise not required in the organization. And that, in a way, it saddened me a little. But anyway, I went in. And then, I found that this was a place where the bank was literally asking you to set up new businesses, and you had quite a bit of leeway to determine what business, what would be the model, who all needed to be talked to about it, what would be the process, what would be the products, what would be the policies, what would be the way you go about the whole thing. There was no playbook, as you were just saying, and it's totally unbeaten path. And believe me, in that 1 year, 8 months, I set up three businesses, started two platforms. One of the most productive periods of my career. I did three joint ventures, got to know most of the regulators, because I was talking to RBI and SEBI and IRDA and PFRDA, you name the regulator, and I was talking to them. It's been one of the best periods of my life. So I think, it's just that I like doing new things. It gives me maybe a high. And I think, it's just that if you enjoy doing something, you end up doing it well.
Right. Thank you. And you mentioned the playbook. So let's kind of open your playbook a little bit. And so what do? You are in a completely uncharted territory, completely, unknown situation. What's your playbook? Like you said, you were in a new role, with no background or baggage. So what are the first two, three things you would do to kind of get started?
So I think the first two, three things is, first and foremost, is you need to listen. You have to ask people, what is it that you want me to know? And then from what they are saying, try and find out what is it that they don't want you to know. So, you have to look for both what you need to know and what people may not be wanting to tell you, but you still want to know. So I think listening is a very, very big part of this. The second thing is, in an organization or in any place where you are going in with a blank page, uh, you can learn from everybody. So it doesn't matter whether it's a very junior person, it doesn't matter if it's the head of the organization, it just doesn't matter who it is. As long as you are talking to them and allowing them to come forth with their observations, you will find that even the tiniest cog in the whole setup will have something that can teach you how things are happening and how they can be made better. So, being humble enough to know that, a lot of people can make contributions, and that you should be open enough to accept that, I think that is also very important. Because it's not only, the seniors or the leaders who know everything. Very often they have only parts of the picture. So you need to really go out there, meet people, and ensure that a lot of people get an opportunity to approach you and talk about how they perceive things to be.
Right. So you spoke of listening and humility. Now tell me, how would your playbook change? Let's say a wartime CEO versus the peacetime CEO. I'm sure you've been in wartime situations. How would you respond to adversity, challenges, when everything is going wrong?
So when everything is going wrong, I think, what you need to show or display basically is courage. You need to be able to tell your people that, look, I will be out there in the front, ahead of everybody else, taking the flak if it's required. You don't have to come to the front till, I'm sort of not able to manage. So I will be there for y'all, and I will step out to the very front. And if you show that courage to be able to take the issues right up to the top, to be able to speak, to be able to give a voice to something that they have not been able to give a voice, very quickly you will find that they will group around you. So it's important, I think, in wartime kind of a situation to be able to show that leadership through sheer courage. To be able to say, it doesn't matter, I will raise my voice. If it gets taken, in a adverse manner, so be it. But I think this needs to get said. I think these actions need to get taken, so I will take them. That I think is what really differentiates you from peacetime, when things can be taken more at a gradual and comfortable pace.
So, courage obviously comes with taking hard calls and unpleasant calls. And today, when I speak with many of our clients, they are having to take unpleasant calls or hard decisions. And sometimes, does it mean sacrificing the long term, or should one try and be contrarian in these challenging times? So, how do you balance the long term? Or let me ask you differently: what are the two, three things that as a leader you will continue to invest in tough times, while you're holding back or cutting back on other investments or other expenses and so on?
So, in times that are challenging, you really need to first and foremost uh, consolidate your position so as to be able to weather the difficult period. Okay. So, I see a lot of companies, really hoarding liquidity. And I think it is, in a way, the right thing to do, because liquidity at the end of the day is what is going to determine whether you survive or not. But while you are hoarding that, you must also realize that you have time which you didn't have earlier in the hurly burly of regular operations. So, what are you going to do with that time? So, with that time, I think what you need to do is to then clarify to yourself what is your long term and your medium term vision, and then start working towards that. Now, what if it means investment? Well, if it means investment, if you are more or less convinced that that's the way to go, then those investments need to get made. Because if you don't make them, your competitor will make them, and they'll be ready to shoot off the ground the moment things become better, whereas you will be left behind. So, survival doesn't only mean that you stay hunkered down as the storm goes on, it also means that you ready yourself to leap out and start doing what you need to do the moment the storm stops. So, yes, while you could have been doing run of the mill investments, you may have to cut back on that. You need to make strategic moves during this period. Exactly where do you want to be and how do you want to be there? Determine what should be your priorities. Having a good skill for prioritization at this point of time is, I think, key to ensuring that you come out better from this. Because, like any other challenge, every challenge on the other side of it is opportunities. So unless and until you move your focus from only the challenge to also the opportunities, you'll probably lose out. So you must use the time that you have to, while you know that you have to take care of something that is current, you must try and see how that is leading on to some opportunities, and then go and ensure that you are in a position to take those opportunities as they come up.
This is a very, very important point that you made. And I think one of the hardest things for us to do is, while fighting for survival, also think strategically and say, hey, these are the three investments possibly I could make, or these are the chinks in my competitor's armor. Let me try and exploit. But I'm going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. But I just want to continue, your leadership journey and ask you. So you spent so long with one organization, and you're all fresh and new in a completely different role. So what have you carried forward from your previous organization or your learning, and what have you left behind?
So, if you look at the two organizations that, I have headed, one was a bank and the other is an IT organization. But at the core of it, they are both service organization. There I was selling financial products, here I'm selling IT products. So basically, at the core of it all, it's still people who are delivering these things. Okay. And therefore, I think what I have brought forward from my earlier experience is my people skills. How do you ensure that you've got the right people in the right place? How do you ensure that you are the enabler that enables your people to come up to potential? How do you ensure that teams are working well together, that there is a spirit of collaboration? Very often, also, what happens is, in this world where, as we say, we are all in a rat race, the rat race becomes more internal than external. So you are competing within as well as you're competing outside. So let's have far less competition within and far more collaboration, and the competition can be left outside. So, how do you ensure that all of this meshes together to give you a really lean, mean fighting machine that actually can go out and implement whatever, the organization needs to be implemented? So, I think, that's something that I really have brought forward. What I have left behind probably are very many practices that had got ingrained in us over a very long period of time. I have also stopped looking at the economic news so very closely as I used to, because at this point of time, I need to look more closely at what is coming out of the IT area. But economic news, of course, is something that I feel very comfortable with. So, there is a habit, there's a tendency of going back to it. But yes, I am trying to move on. You also must understand that in my earlier organization, the average age was 47 and above. Okay. And here it's at least there's a 20 years gap. So, the way I used to treat those people cannot be the way I treat my people here. It's far, far different. For one thing, I've stopped people saying Mrs. Bhattacharya and Madam. So now I'm Arundhati to everybody. So, those are the little things that I think, I have sort of tried to leave behind and go on to become something where, my current workforce is comfortable having me around, comfortable communicating with me.
Thank you, Arundhati. This is really insightful. Learning and unlearning, I guess, both are very important parts of our leadership journey. I now want to move on to corporate India.
Yep.
And when I say corporate India, first I would like to kind of address questions my clients, our clients have as leaders themselves. And you've seen so many economic cycles and you've seen so many businesses deal with those economic cycles. And you've met or dealt with so many entrepreneurs. What attributes do you see of entrepreneurs who are able to go very deep into a crisis and are able to emerge? And then we'll talk about the business side of it later on.
Okay. So, yes, I have seen a lot of cycles. Frankly, in spite of that, I don't think I have seen anything like this pandemic. And the reason for that is that there is no sunset clause in this pandemic. We don't know when it's going to end. So I always used to think that India has experienced VUCA moments, especially, in respect of, say, something like the demonetization, which came on us without much, prior warning. And it was definitely a defining moment in how industry sort of stood up in the face of such huge uncertainty. But at least in the demonetization, we knew that by a particular period of time, the whole thing would end. Whereas in this pandemic, we don't know when it'll end. And even if you open up, the next day you may be closing down again. So, there are cycles within cycles in this pandemic. And that's something very difficult because the one thing that business hates, it's uncertainty. Uncertainty is really the biggest enemy of any business. You can, if you know how long this will go on, then you can plan accordingly and you can still be there. But if you're uncertain about it, you don't know whether what you're doing is sufficient or not. So yes, this cycle is very different. Now, who are the people that we expect will survive? I think there are two or three things over there. One, of course, as I said, at the end of the day, cash is king. So if you don't have the liquidity, then, it's something that's very, very worrying. And you do need to ensure that you have short-term liquidity that you can tap into. That's very important for all businesses. That's absolutely, the phase zero, as I call it. So that's very important. But more than that, over and above that, what are the businesses that survive? I have found that there are two very clear things, which make businesses survive. One is governance. Wherever people have really got good standards of governance, where they have been plowing back money into businesses, where they have taken the business as something that's given to them in trust and protected that business and enhanced that business the way they would something which is totally their own. Those are businesses that I have seen have really done well. So governance of any company, I think, that determines whether it is sustainable or not. And the second thing I think, that really make businesses stand out is innovation. And as you know, innovation again is something where you have to go out of your comfort zone. So you're doing very well in a business, things are great. Now, there is a tendency to remain there. Well, things are going great. Why should I try to innovate? Why should I try to think differently? But if you're not already peering ahead, then there is no way of knowing which day you are going to get disrupted. And then, you will be in a position where you'll have to run much harder in order to just retain the position that you are in. So, people who constantly look forward, people who generate within the organization an atmosphere of innovation, those are the companies that are more likely to survive. Again, let me tell you, doing this within an established company is very, very tough. To be innovative within a legacy setup is probably the most tough thing that anybody can ask you to do. And so you have to find ways of doing it. In SBI, what we did, we created a 200 crore fund with board approval, which could be used for either seed funding some of the fintechs, or getting into a JV with them, or even going on a transaction by transaction costing with them, making them our vendors. And we put together a very eminent team, including some outsiders, to look at fintechs who could apply to us, and then determine whether there is an adjacency to what we are doing, or whether fits into something that we are seeing in the future, and then actually handhold them so that they could play in our sandbox and create that atmosphere of innovation. Because otherwise, what happens is, when you are innovating, you will fail, and if you fail, the legacy atmosphere or environment simply drowns you out as money that is going waste, and you don't have a chance to sort of rejig, retool, and come up again with something so that you correct the mistakes and then take it forward again. So innovating from within a company is very, very tough. You have to find ways of doing it, and I can tell you, I don't think there was any other public sector unit that had created a fund of this sort at the time there when I had done it. So the fact is, you've got to find some ways in which you will keep looking forward. You will keep looking beyond what is immediately visible, to try and guess what the future will be. Having said that, in spite of that, none of us knew that there would be a pandemic coming. Though there's so much has been written about it, so much has been talked about it. I remember, I think, in our ICAP document, we were looking at something like 62 scenarios. None of these scenarios related to a pandemic. Okay. So obviously there are 63rd, 4th, 5th, 6th scenarios, and we will fail in some ways or the other. But I think the sheer fact that you're looking ahead, trying to determine what you will do in order to make yourself resilient, that helps. That helps, and definitely that is something I think, that over a period of time, it ensures that the unit becomes more resilient, more sustainable. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, can you hear me, Arundhati?
Yes, yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a follow-on question on governance. And I'm not going to try and put you on a spot, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate corporate India on governance, 10 being the highest?
I think corporate India has a long way to go, long way to go. Because again, I don't blame anybody. I think you have to realize that, we are just 70 years old as a nation, and that's not very long. If you look at what we were before the British rule, we had flourishing businesses, we had manufacturing, we had a lot of things. By the time the British left, we were basically left with very little manufacturing. It was all just production on the land and trading. We were basically a nation of traders. There was hardly any manufacturing. From that, in 70 years' time, we have actually come a long distance. But in this distance, the amount of time that we have covered, it's not enough for us, for the corporations that we have set up to really mature. And they have had very little time to mature. They've really been pushed into the modern age very, very quickly. So to that extent, I think that we are still on the path to corporate governance maturity, and there is a long distance for us to cover still.
Thank you. And let me now talk to you about the second factor you mentioned, innovation. And there's this thing called Jugaad and innovation. Where are we as corporate India?
So Jugaad is good and bad. Again, you can take nuclear technology and use it to make a bomb, or you can use it for peaceful purposes. So Jugaad is like that. Jugaad is good, because I personally believe that if you are in a VUCA world, only Jugaad is going to keep you alive. But if you use Jugaad for the wrong things, well, then you will have to face the music, so to speak. So I don't think Jugaad is a bad thing. In fact, I should think that frugal innovation done in the right way should be the strength that India brings to the table. We should be able to make the best of things with the lowest of costs. When the Prime Minister was talking about the Mars mission, he said, if you take a per kilometer cost, it costs less than what a three-wheeler auto rickshaw ride costs you for a trip from Ahmedabad to Gandhinagar. Now, if that's the case, that's great. That's great Jugaad. So that's the kind of Jugaad we should look for. Jugaad is not bad per se. It's what we do with it that could be wrong, but it could also be very right.
Talk to us, if you could, about the upcoming business models, the businesses of the future. So obviously we have understood the constraints. Obviously governance is one factor, innovation is one factor. There could be other constraints on people, processes and all. Now leapfrogging from here to the future, what does it look to you like from a corporate India perspective? What are the areas that we need to cover?
So I think, most of corporate India is now looking at a few things. One is, first of all, if they are giving either goods or services, they want an omni-channel method of delivery. So, just a physical model or just an online model, neither of them seem to have worked very well in the crisis. Okay. So what really worked was a hybrid model. You had the neighborhood shop where you could literally sort of WhatsApp your requirements and the fellow delivered to your house. So what you really need, and that's a very simple example of what could happen. So on the one hand, corporates are looking for omni-channel models. And this omni-channel could be for customers, could be for dealers, suppliers, employees, whatever. And they are looking for a model that allows people to work from anywhere. Again, they could be your employees, they could be your suppliers, but they should be having the ability and the facility to work from wherever. These are, I think, two constructs that are coming up. We've seen a lot of people reaching out to us. They were earlier only selling on Amazon and Flipkart. Now, while they want to continue selling on Amazon and Flipkart, they also want an e-commerce portal of their own, because they don't know when those will not be able to deliver. So they want something that they can call their own and where they can push. So, people are looking for all of these add-ons, so to speak, to sort of go on to the next model of how they will survive. And two things also that people have now understood. Earlier, data, the ability to use data and digital platforms, at least for many businesses, they knew it was something that was nice to have. Today, it is no longer a nice to have, it's an imperative to have these. Because without that, you actually don't have your eyes and ears anymore. Imagine a branch. It had a brick and mortar presence, it had eyes and ears that could actually report what is happening at the branches. That's not there anymore. The branches are closed. So, what do you do? How do you get to those places? So, what you really need is data to tell you how to be more efficient. For instance, think about a dealership and you are pushing goods out to your dealers. Now, suddenly you find that that particular area is getting closed down. Now, all of your shipments, can you divert them immediately into another area which is actually green? But you won't be able to do that unless you see that area turn from green to orange and red. And you need to see it almost real time so as to be able to save whatever you can out of this particular operation. So, data is something that's really and truly going to empower people. If you're looking at your work, the data is what will tell you, no matter where they are, whether they are performing or not performing. Just recently, somebody was telling me, and this was a person from one of the banks, and he was saying, I would have loved to have made everybody online, but then I didn't know how to measure the productivity. Something that can always be done because they are producing something, and you can actually assess exactly what that production has been. I can tell you in this new company that I'm in, we are 100% online, okay? And we can assess productivity. And the strange thing was, in the first 2 months of the lockdown, the productivity increase was enormous. People were actually working so well from home. Today, it has dropped a little bit because now I think people are beginning to realize that this is causing burnout. So earlier, for instance, if a support request came in the middle of the night, the fellow would jump to the screen and get it done. In fact, we had to tell them that you're not supposed to be on duty at that point of time. So please don't do it. It's okay if you do it in the morning. It's known that you are off, that you are actually sleeping. But that's how you can assess, no matter where people are, whether they are slacking, whether they are producing. And frankly, if even with slacking they are producing more, allow them to slack. Why do you need to keep peering over their shoulders? You don't have to. It's not required. So I think, the way we will do business now will be different. And that will be empowered both by the digital platforms and by data. And the more we understand how data can be used, the more empowered we will be.
This was a question I had for later, but let me ask you now. What challenges do you see with the CEOs of today or corporate India today when it comes to adoption of technology? I see half yes, half no. And sometimes I also see boardrooms are also not ready or maybe not informed enough. Where do you see what is the challenge?
So, I think one thing is very clear. In respect of the installations that we have done, we out of Salesforce have done, we've done the same stuff in two very similar companies. One has been a roaring success, the other has been so-so. And if you ask me what is the difference between the two, I will say it is the passion and involvement of the CEOs. Somehow or the other, I think in India, and I'm not so sure this is exactly the same in companies abroad, but I think probably it is. In India, if the number one is not seen to be totally committed and passionate about something, things don't move. Now, when you are doing something like implementation of technology, you are actually bringing in a whole new paradigm. Now, with a whole new paradigm, what happens is that there is within the company a change management program that you need to run. Okay? People are used to certain screens. People are used to certain ways of doing things. Now, suddenly all of that has got disrupted. Okay? You are seeing new types of screens, stuff that you used to put in before no longer needs to be put in. So, you start resenting it because the stuff that you knew how to draw from the system, you no longer know how to draw it. It's there. It's probably simpler to draw it out, but you don't know it. And you don't know it because you haven't been through the change management program. you haven't seen the utility of all of this, you are not convinced that it's the right thing, and you have not trained for it. So I think, it is important when you are doing a transformation, especially a tech transformation, for the CEO to have the passion to bring the whole company along, and to ensure that he creates, a proper change management program, a proper training program, a proper communication program of what this change is intending you to do. I know, believe me, when I got into the bank, it was totally manual. Okay. So I have seen the various changes as they have happened as we went into the computerized situation. The first few attempts we made, they were merely replicating exactly what we used to do in the manual era. So even the ledger page, we would have loved it to look the same. Okay. So it takes time for people to move from something with which they have become comfortable into something else. And there, the CEO's involvement, the CEO's leadership is very important. And that's the difference we see, when we do similar installations in two similar organizations and see one being a roaring success and the other not so much.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And many times when I interact with some of our CEO clients and I would ask them, hey, what's your technology strategy? They'll say, go ask my CTO. And I would listen, you are the CTO. You have to be the CTO. I wanted to actually, I just wanted to come back to corporate India. And this is very important for many of our clients to understand or talk about is the balance sheet. So what has gone wrong? What could be done? How should, going forward, our clients look at their balance sheets? What to watch out for?
So, in a balance sheet, there is very clearly, equity and debt. Okay. And the fact of the matter is, if you don't have that financial structure right, then you are looking at a very deep abyss. Traditionally, in India, debt was cheaper than equity. And in any case, we are a developing country, a resource starved country. We didn't have enough equity. Okay. So most people felt that debt is cheap and the downside was very limited, because if you go into the courts, you are there forever. It never comes out, and you can continue to run your business as normal. Now, as a result, what happened is many people ventured out with sliver thin equity and a lot of debt. Some of the debt would actually, you know, uh, be disguised. Some of the equity would actually be disguised debt. So you may be actually, borrowing from, say, a relative, but you may be paying him or her 18% interest. You're
Yeah.
showing that as equity brought into the company. That's not equity, that's debt. You need to pay the interest on it. Now, what happens is there is a role for debt and equity in a balance sheet. The equity is there for a reason. It's there because it doesn't need a return during tough times and is able to absorb the shock. And you obviously give it a higher return during good times because that's why they have taken the risk. So the risk and return is well balanced. Debt, on the other hand, is like a taximeter. The moment you take it, it starts ticking and it does not stop, regardless of whether your business is working or not working. And therefore, without adequate dollops of equity, if there is a downturn, you are going to go into a tailspin because you will not have the money to service that equity, which is actually debt masquerading as equity. Okay. So I think, this financial structuring of our business is something we need to really understand. As you know, in India, there was at least till maybe say 7 8 years back a very healthy dislike of or unhealthy dislike of private equity, because people always felt it's my labor, it's my company, and when it comes to it, these guys take away the fruits of it. Well, that's the price that you pay for having that equity, for people taking a risk, a bet on you. Otherwise, you would not have been able to put in this business at all. So, yes, they may be taking away the lion's share, but then they risk their money on you. So I think this understanding has to sort of really, be understood, appreciated, and then taken along. Because that's what most balance sheets have suffered from: lack of equity.
So, what do we do today now that we understand that we don't have enough equity and the markets are the way they are? And this is especially true for mid-sized businesses where the walls are closing in on them financially. So, what are the one a couple of things that they need to do today to at least manage this and come out of this?
So I would say, if you look at the biggest company in India, look at what they have done. They've done huge money raises, right? And they have done that money raise by selling off equity. So, we should take a lesson from that and understand that we have to bring in people with far deeper pockets and give ourselves that space to breathe so that we can come out well on the other side. If you say the markets are all frozen, how will we get this at this point of time? I personally think that's not really strictly true. People are still willing to bet on you. But that is where the governance piece comes in. If your governance has been good, if your innovation has been good, these are the two things that people who are out there in the market wanting to put in equity will look for. So your reputation needs to be, absolutely clean. And you need to show that, yes, I have the ability to see beyond the curve to what will be the next growth factor, and I have the ability to grow. For people like these, equity is still forthcoming. There is enough money in the market. I don't think there is a shortage of money. It's a question of being able to have that reputation. Now, if you neither have that reputation nor that, frankly speaking, it will not survive. That business will not survive. Though it sounds pretty drastic, but that's how it's going to be. And that's the reason why in the good times it's so important for us to build that reputation, to be known for the kind of standards that you maintain, so that in tough times there will be people who will stand beside you.
Yes, and I do. I mean, willingness is the step one. And because you can always argue the valuation is not good enough, it's fairly low. What should I do? But I think willingness is the point number one.
Absolutely, absolutely. At one point of time, you have to understand that you have to lose some battles in order to win the war.
Right.
You can't win all battles. Okay,
Right.
it's okay to retreat because you're retreating in order to advance at a later stage, and you need to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And so let's talk about India a little bit, the Indian economy, the macro view. So, a quick question: India's cup half full or half empty?
Well, I would say, I am an optimist by nature, so I would say half full.
So tell us, as we come out of this crisis at a macro level, what are the few metrics or data points we should watch out for that will tell us, hey, we are getting healthy again?
So I think one thing that you really need to look at is the demand. How is demand shaping up? How is demand rolling up? That is very, very important for us because, frankly, if you remember pre COVID, we were heading into a real slide, on the GDP on the back of very low demand. So now, there is a pent up demand in the market, and that pent up demand will want to be satisfied, but then that should persist. That shouldn't dip down again. So I think, and these are not really quantitative numbers, but what you really want to see is confidence in the market. Confidence that, being in this market is a good thing, that there is a great future for us out there, and that, yes, we can get things done. We have the ability, we have the talent, and we have the markets. So I think, what you really need to look for is the confidence that comes back, is the demand that comes back. These are the sort of things that will point out that we are headed again in the right direction.
So let me try and put you on the spot again and ask you this question, Arundhati. If you were the finance minister, what would you have done to this crisis?
I don't want to answer that question at all, and I won't answer it because that's the fun of in a Q&A. You can choose to answer or not choose to answer.
Right.
But
So,
I
but you
can
give
tell
us
you
the
what,
view.
yeah, I can tell you what I would love to get done. In the sense that what I would say that people are looking out for, not love to get done, but what are people looking for? People are looking in India for what is called true ease of business. And when I'm talking of true ease of business, what I'm saying is that, if I'm going to set up a business today, I should be held by somebody from the center and the state that I'm going to put that business in till such time as the lights come on. Okay? So that's what I want, because I don't want to go from place to place to place. Somebody says something else, somebody says something else, there is another requirement that comes up. It's too complicated and it's too difficult. Most countries that have managed to do well with investment are countries that have what is called the concierge system, where literally, people handhold you through that entire process till, as I said, the lights come on. So that gives a lot of confidence. That gives a lot of confidence in people investing that this country is serious, this country means business. Okay? And I know that this is a model that's being done in some of the states, and it's worked very well in those states. It's worked excellently well in those states. So it's not something that is foreign to us. It's not something that we have not done, but we need to do it consistently from the center, from the states. Okay. The second thing is, I think, we need to do something about ensuring that uh, we we respect that we respect the fact that once we have a contract is a contract. And therefore, it's something that needs to be honored. We have to be far more timely in ensuring that we honor our contracts, that we pay on time. So, disputes and things like that will always be there. And there are ways of, taking care of them. For instance, if there is a contract for payment for whatever, for say a construction piece, and there is a dispute, surely that dispute is a percentage of that entire bill. So you take out that percentage and pay the rest. Why do you hold up the whole thing till it goes into the arbitration, till it goes into the high court, and then maybe even to the Supreme Court before you make payment? Doesn't make sense. So, we have to get this whole cycle to become far more efficient. Unless and until we make this cycle far more efficient, on the one hand, how we start it off, and then on the other hand, how we sort of rotate it, how we allow it to roll, and how we ensure that it happens quickly and well. I think both of these two things, need a lot of attention, and we need to do something in order to get it right, get that model right.
Yeah, definitely. And if I may just ask a linked question, this whole narrative that is building up on let's make in India, let's export from India, let's become, the provider of goods to the rest of the world. The reality is we have less than 2% share in world trade. A country like Vietnam does exports of what, about $300 billion. We are at $300 billion. So is it real? Do you think that we will be able to achieve that?
So, if we put our minds to it, we can achieve anything. Absolutely anything. I believe that. Okay. You look at the PPEs. We didn't have a single unit doing a single PPE. Now you're producing more than 1 lakh PPEs per day, and at 1/3 of the cost that we were importing it at. How did that happen? Because we put our minds to it. So, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. We are good. We are good at frugal innovation, really, really good at it. We may call it by a pejorative term like jugaad, but we are really, really good at it. So if we are so good at it, why aren't we doing much more of that? Smoothen the way for people to do it. That's what's important. If you smoothen the way for people to do it, you will find that there are lots and lots of entrepreneurs who are willing to do it that way. From the entrepreneur side, on the other hand, like I told you right before, that while we are waiting for the policymakers to do this, from the entrepreneur side, what we really think, what we really need is for them to understand that there are certain rules that we play by, certain governance standards that we maintain. Those have to be maintained. You do the frugal innovation, but you don't do it by taking shortcuts. You
Right.
don't do it by creating shoddy material. You don't do it by circumventing taxation. You don't do those things. So, you
Right.
have to lay out the rules of the game and then allow people to play it well.
Yeah. So I want to move to what you are doing now as a CEO of a technology company and a fairly large company globally. But before you talk about what you're doing now, tell us, there's this whole term called the fourth industrial revolution. What is it? I mean, is it just a hype or fad, or is it real? And what can we do sitting in India as corporate India to adopt it or embrace it?
So, it's not hype and it's very real. Okay. So, and it's all to do with, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, virtual reality, augmented reality. So, it's to do with all of that. And frankly, I think, we are no longer talking about when it'll be on us. I think we are in the middle of it already. The pandemic has only sort of pushed us into it. Probably we were waiting on the edge and teetering for a long time. Now we are absolutely there. So, a lot of stuff that we were doing physically, we no longer now need to do physically. It can all be done on the on the digital platform. Because, today's conference or webinar, whatever you call it, for instance, we wouldn't have done it like this. We would have been in a hall somewhere and it would have been a stage on which you and I would be sitting and chatting. That's now no longer required. And in a way, it's good because in a hall, we could have probably put in 1,000 people. Today, you'll probably be able to take this to many more. So, to that extent, that's exactly what the fourth industrial revolution uh, expects to do. That it will use more and more of artificial intelligence to say what is required and how it can be done. How do we become much more efficient? It will use machine learning processes to make responses sharper and sharper. It will augment your reality. So today, for instance, that we are sitting in our rooms, okay, and we have a background of whatever is available over here. I know that there are certain platforms you can have a virtual background, but it doesn't yet give you a great feeling. But surely that's going to happen, and there will come a time when we will actually be sort of seen as sitting on that stage because you are in that augmented reality space. And so, it will feel far more immediate, it will feel far more real, so to speak. So the fact of the matter is, these are the things that are going to come. They have already started. And I think, people who refuse to see that it is there, people who refuse to believe that, it's going to happen, they are like ostriches, they have their head buried in the sand. They need to look up and look around and see what's happening, because this is definitely the reality of today and tomorrow.
Right. And now tell us about your role and what you're attempting to achieve. What are you building?
So, Salesforce had its operation in India in 2000 from 2010, but it was a very small operation. It wasn't really very big. It was more on the support and engineering side. And then in 2017, they seriously started the sales and distribution piece because they felt that it was time that they started looking at the India market. And now, in 2020, I have come on because now they want to really create a far larger India hub. And the India hub will not be like any other country in the world, in the sense that the India hub will definitely have sales and distribution, but it will also have the engineering, R&D, and the support side of it. Okay, and there will be actually many more people over there than in the sales and distribution piece. But we also know that if we don't grow big in sales and distribution, if we don't become a household name, we won't be getting the best of talents. We will get the best of talent when people know us just as well as they know some of the other big names in the IT industry. And the reason why I came on is to try and create that story in India for Salesforce. So Salesforce wants to create an India story, and that's what I have been given as a mandate, that go ahead and create it.
Right. So I wish you the very best, Arundhati, in this new role. Yes, it's an amazing company. It's a great opportunity. So now, how could clients benefit from what you have to offer?
Well, I think, they need to look at our products, and if they look at it, they will understand how they can benefit. So, we have a sales cloud, we have a service cloud, we have marketing cloud products, and now, there is a delivery of an industry cloud as well as a health cloud. So, we have all kinds of things that address all of the issues that could be there in any organization. So, starting from sales to service to dealers, to retail, to your suppliers, the employee journey. We have a very, really good employee learning platform, which, at this point of time, in fact, there are almost 1 million developers that are certified on that platform, and it's the highest number outside of the US. So it's called Trailhead. So, we have the employee journey that we can do very well. Plus, we have recently acquired a few companies such as Tableau and MuleSoft. So, what Tableau does is basically puts all of your data into extremely usable form for you to understand what the data is showing. Similarly, for MuleSoft actually provides you the API layer over and above your legacy systems, so that you can in a very agile manner, connect on to very many other platforms. So, that really gives you the agility, the ease of implementation, which without that layer, it would be very difficult to get. So, we are continuing to acquire companies such as this, which value add to whatever our core basic products are. We are not just a CRM company. When I was coming into Salesforce, I used to ask a lot of people, what do you think of them? And they used to say, well, they have the best CRM. But that's not what we are only best in. There are a lot of other things that Salesforce does really, really well. And I'm hoping that, I would be able to bring those tools to our clients, because that will spell far more efficiency and productivity than they have seen.
Right. That sounds exciting. And yeah, I would love to myself come and understand some
Mm.
of and experiment with some of these solutions.
Most welcome. Most
Right.
welcome.
We are just about running out of time, and I want to take one or two questions if it's okay with you, Arundhati.
Okay, you
Just
just have
for
to
two,
do. Yeah.
2 minutes, yeah. And there's one question I can see on the queue. It's been asked by one of our dear clients, Sanjeev Sachar. He's asking us, do you think that corporate India has matured to firmly believe that people are the key asset?
Well, no, I don't think it is matured enough to believe that, and they should. So, and I can see the difference because I'm working now in an American multinational, and frankly speaking, the amount of attention they give to employee safety protection is phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. Not only safety and protection, but also the way they have the conversations to enable you to improve, the way they keep pushing you to keep learning. I think all of this is actually something that we need to imitate. In India, while many more organizations are now becoming a little more conscious about their employees, but you're quite right. Consciousness about employees, their requirements, their satisfaction levels, their training needs, their the conversations that we need to have. Very often I find one strange thing: Indians, they think that they're very polite when they're not pointing out to you what you're not really doing well. Now, unless and until somebody holds the mirror to me and tells me that, look, boss, you're doing this good, but here, you need to improve, I will not improve. So it's important to have those courageous conversations. How many of Indian corporates have courageous conversations? Very few of them. Very, very few of them. So I think on the people front, we need to do a lot more than we are doing now.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to answer one more question because this is also linked to people, and that will be the final question. I won't ask you any more questions. This is again from a client. He's asking, how do you build the intellectual rigor in your team and organization as a whole? How do you get everyone to skill up constantly?
So you have to really push. You really and truly have to push. As I said, we have Trailhead, which is really very good, which gives me an understanding of who has done what and what they are lacking on. But I think this is an area which really has to be pushed a lot, because the world is changing so fast that if you're not learning constantly, then you are actually slipping back. And you can't afford to do that, just can't afford to do it. And therefore, I think this intellectual rigor and the ability to push people ahead on the skills front is actually something very material, and especially so, I would say, in service organization that depend upon the quality of their people to actually deliver great results. So you have to keep pushing them. That's the only way. Keep assessing them, keep pushing them, keep encouraging them, and motivate them. Find ways for them to do it, almost playfully, and not as though they are taking a class in one of those old-fashioned classes. Make it such that they can do it playfully. Do it in little dollops. Do it as group activities. But you need to constantly keep doing it.
Well, as you say, gamification of learning.
Yep,
Right.
absolutely.
On
Important.
that note, we will close, Arundhati. It's been an honor, privilege, and a delight to have you. And I would love to extend another invite to you. There's
Oh,
so many more things
1 hour.
we would love to talk about. But thank you so much for your insights. We covered a range of subjects. I'm sure our clients found it very, very insightful. And I also want to thank all our clients of Edelweiss, clients of Salesforce, the entire community. Thank you, and thank you to our teams for making this happen. Thanks a lot, Arundhati.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Signing off now.